What's up guys, this is part 4 of explaining the lore of the Five Nights at Freddy's games. In this video, I talk about the lore of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. As always, remember to subscribe if you haven't already and please like the video. It would help me out a lot, please enjoy. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 marks a dramatic shift in how the story is told, moving away from restaurants, night guards and corporate cover-ups, and instead focusing on a deeply personal tragedy. Rather than placing the player in a security office, the game traps them inside a child's bedroom, immediately reframing the horror as intimate and psychological. This change in setting signals that the story is no longer about the aftermath of crimes alone, but about their origin and emotional consequences. The fourth game strips the series down to fear in its most vulnerable form, childhood terror. Everything the player sees and hears is filtered through the perspective of a frightened child, which makes the narrative less reliable, but far more emotionally charged. At the center of Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is the crying child, a young boy plagued by fear of the animatronics and the world around him. The minigames between nights depict his daily life, showing a household filled with neglect, cruelty, and silence. The child is constantly crying, bullied by other children, and most notably tormented by his older brother, who repeatedly scares him using a foxy mask. These scenes establish that the child's fear is not irrational or sudden, it is cultivated through repeated emotional trauma. The animatronics he fears are not just mascots, but symbols of everything that makes him feel unsafe, including his own family. The house itself feels cold and empty, reinforcing the idea that the child is emotionally isolated, even when surrounded by people. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is the first game to strongly imply the existence of the Afton family as a central force in the series' story. The crying child is widely believed to be the youngest son of William Afton, the man later revealed to be responsible for the murders connected to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. William's presence in the game is distant and unsettling. He is rarely seen directly, but his influence is everywhere, particularly through the Fredbear's family diner and the technology associated with it. The older brother, often identified as Michael Afton, becomes a key figure in the tragedy. His cruelty toward the crying child appears careless at first, but over time it becomes clear that his actions are part of a larger pattern of emotional neglect within the family. This household is not one of overt violence, but of absence, where fear is allowed to grow unchecked. The minigames gradually build toward the central event of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, the Bite of 1983. Fredbear's family diner is portrayed as a smaller, earlier version of the later restaurants, centered around Fredbear and Spring Bonnie. For the crying child, this place represents pure terror. He associates it with animatronics that feel alive and predatory, even if others see them as harmless. On his birthday, the older brother and his friends carry him toward Fredbear as a cruel joke, mocking his fear instead of acknowledging it. This moment is the emotional and narrative climax of the game. When Fredbear's mouth clamps down on the child's head, the event is sudden, horrifying, and irreversible. Unlike later tragedies in the series, this one is not caused by murder, but by negligence and cruelty, making it feel disturbingly realistic. The Bite of 1983 redefines the role of fear in the Five Nights at Freddy's story. The crying child's fear was consistently dismissed, weaponized, and ignored until it directly led to his death. This reframes the series' ongoing theme of denial in a more personal way. Just as the company ignores the danger of its animatronics, the family ignores the emotional pain of the child. The older brother's reaction after the bite, kneeling beside the hospital bed and apologizing, is one of the most human moments in the franchise. It suggests that guilt, once realized, cannot undo harm. This moment is often interpreted as the beginning of Michael Afton's long journey through the series, driven by regret and a desire to make amends for what cannot be fixed. The nightmare animatronics that stalk the player during the nights are not meant to be taken as literal machines in the traditional sense. Their exaggerated teeth, distorted shapes, and animalistic behavior suggest they are manifestations of fear rather than physical threats. They embody how the crying child perceives the animatronics, not as entertainers, but as monsters waiting to attack. The bedroom setting reinforces this interpretation, as it resembles a child's imagination spiraling in the dark. Every creak, breath, and flick of light becomes a potential threat. These nightmares blur the line between reality and imagination, implying that the child's mind is trapped in a constant state of terror, even while awake. "I will put you back together." One of the most mysterious and debated lines in the entire series appears at the end of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. "I will put you back together." This line is spoken as the crying child fades away, and its meaning is deliberately unclear. It is often associated with William Afton, suggesting a promise rooted in obsession rather than compassion. Rather than accepting death, William may be attempting to defy it, leading to the creation of possessed animatronics and experiments with life and consciousness. Alternatively, the line can be interpreted as symbolic, representing the beginning of the chain of events that bind souls to machines throughout the series. Either way, it confirms that the crying child's death is not an ending, but a catalyst. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is deeply concerned with how trauma repeats itself across time. The crying child's fear echoes in the haunted animatronics of later games, suggesting that emotional pain leaves a lasting imprint on the world. The setting of the game, confined to a house and a diner, contrasts with the sprawling locations of later titles, but the consequences ripple outward. The bite leads to changes in animatronic design, safety protocols, and eventually to the events referenced in future games. In this way, Five Nights at Freddy's 4 shows that the horror of the series does not begin with murder, but with cruelty, neglect, and the refusal to listen. While the minigames of Five Nights at Freddy's 4 clearly place the player in the role of the crying child during the daytime segments, the identity of who we play as during the nights is far more complex, and is one of the most important revelations tied to the game's deeper lore. Strong evidence suggests that the nighttime gameplay does not occur from the crying child's perspective at all, but instead from that of Michael Afton, the older brother, years after the events of the bite of 1983. This distinction is crucial, because it transforms the nights from literal childhood nightmares into manifestations of guilt, memory, and psychological punishment. Rather than reliving fear, the player is reliving responsibility. One of the strongest indicators that the night sections belong to Michael Afton is the nature of the environment itself. The bedroom layout during the nights does not perfectly match the crying child's room shown in the minigames, implying that what we see is not a direct memory, but a reconstructed or symbolic space. This suggests that the nights are dreams rather than real events, shaped by memory and remorse. Michael, having caused the incident that led to his brother's death, would logically be haunted by exaggerated, monstrous versions of the animatronics associated with that trauma. The nightmare animatronics resemble twisted versions of Fredbear, Foxy, Bonnie, and Chica, but they are far more aggressive and grotesque, reflecting how guilt distorts memory over time. Additional support for Michael as the nighttime protagonist comes from later connections across the series. In subsequent games, Michael is consistently portrayed as someone who willingly places himself in dangerous situations connected to Freddy Fazbear's locations, almost as if he believes he deserves suffering. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 fits perfectly into this pattern if the nights are interpreted as Michael mentally punishing himself, replaying the fear his brother felt, but amplifying it through adult awareness. The breathing mechanics, the need to listen carefully at doors, and the absence of any real defense all contribute to a sense of vulnerability that mirrors emotional dread rather than physical danger. This is not a child afraid of monsters, it is an older sibling afraid of what he has done. The nightmare animatronics themselves reinforce this interpretation through their design and behavior. Nightmare Fredbear in particular appears far more frequently and aggressively than the others, positioning him as the central threat. This makes narrative sense if Fredbear is the animatronic directly responsible for the bite of 1983. For Michael, Fredbear would not simply be a character, but the symbol of the moment his life irreversibly changed. The exaggerated teeth, the constant focus on the mouth, and the way Nightmare Fredbear dominates the later nights all suggest a mind fixated on a single traumatic event. These are not random fears, they are precise and obsessive. There is also an important thematic contrast between the crying child's fear and Michael's fear. The crying child fears what might happen, while Michael fears what already did. The nights reflect this difference. The crying child's fear was rooted in uncertainty and imagination, but Michael's fear is rooted in memory and regret. This reframes the game's horror entirely. The player is not trying to survive to see morning in a literal sense, but attempting to endure an internal reckoning that cannot be escaped. Each night becomes a confrontation with responsibility rather than a fight against external danger. This interpretation also aligns with the broader arc of Michael Afton across the series. He is repeatedly depicted as someone trying to fix the past, even though the past cannot be fixed. The nights of Five Nights at Freddy's 4 represent the earliest stage of that journey. Before he seeks answers in abandoned restaurants or confronts the legacy of his father, Michael is trapped in his own mind, reliving the consequences of a moment of cruelty he can never take back. The nightmares are not warnings or premonitions, they are reminders. Ultimately, viewing Michael Afton as the nighttime protagonist gives Five Nights at Freddy's 4 a deeper emotional coherence. The game becomes a story told from two perspectives of the same tragedy, the innocent fear of a child and the crushing guilt of the one who caused that fear to become fatal. The nights are not about what happened in 1983, but about what happens afterward, when the screaming stops and only memory remains. In this way, Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is not just a horror game, but a study of how guilt can haunt someone more relentlessly than any animatronic ever could. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 functions as the emotional origin point of the entire story. It reveals that before there were haunted suits and hidden bodies, there was a scared child whose fear was treated as entertainment. By focusing on family, guilt, and psychological horror, the game reframes the series as a tragedy rather than a simple mystery. The crying child's death does not just explain why the world of Five Nights at Freddy's is broken, it explains why it stays broken. The game leaves the player with no sense of victory, only the understanding that some horrors are born not from monsters, but from the moments when empathy fails. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment if you have your own theories about this game or any other Five Nights at Freddy's games for that matter. Thanks for watching.